Iburu, Iboya, Ibuche, Che, everybody on Cyberland. It's your favorite Bawalao. At least I hope so. Omodo Dile K coming at you with another great video. At least I hope so. But it's not gonna be on the help me help you. Those are still in cycle. Those are still continue. My PTV, my wife, she's knocking them out. She's got them in order, first come, first serve, and we're gonna get those out. But today, I wanted to talk to you about a topic that my goddaughter brought up, and then kind of made me think a little bit. And I was trying to really piece it together in my head based on what I understand. But then, there's just so much. When we talk about a spider web effect, we talk about a topic that's here. And then spider webs constantly have different strings that hang off of it, and then you have another string that kind of wraps around it. And if you picture it, there's just so much going on just to get to the center. So the 7 African powers was the question. What are the 7 African powers? Now, many of you understand that I'm a Babalao. Many of you understand that I speak on an Afro-Cubano aspect of things. Many of you understand the aspect of a Babalao is to understand Ifa. Understanding Ifa doesn't matter if you're Afro-Cubano, doesn't matter if you're traditional. Understanding the philosophy and the effects of things when we talk about Ifa comes from, it's a universal aspect. There is no lineage there, right? Now, how we manipulate and how we organize ourselves and techniques and some of the deeper meanings of things is when we begin to branch off to a traditional and an Afro-Cubano house. But that's not the point here. The point here is when we speak about the 7 African powers, we need to understand our history, which means that we're going to have to dig in a little further. We're going to have to get into a traditional side of the house, and we need to understand how they live. We all understand that when we talk about the 7 African powers, at a certain point in time in Africa, in Nigeria, we speak about the 7 main houses, the 7 main tribes. All right, and even then, that's controversial because some people would challenge you and say there wasn't 7 main tribes, there was maybe 9 main tribes. But that's not the point. When we talk about the 7 African powers, talk about Obatala, Chango, Ochum, Oya, and the list goes on. But you talk about the 7 African powers, and you could go into any botanica and you see the 7 African powers, they're all laid out. You got Orula, Obatala, you got Ogun, you got Chango, you got Lewa, you got Obatala, but they're there. 7 African powers, right? But a lot of people try to understand, like, what is this 7 African powers? Is it a divinity? Is it what are we talking about? This is what we're talking about. The 7 African powers was a evolution that was destined to come. An evolution that was spoken to by Ifa long ago in the sign Odi Olbe, Oldibre. Odibre is the representation of the 7 African powers. But to understand the 7 African powers is to understand, okay, this is how they used to live. Now we have what's called the slave trade, right? We had this oppression that came through and started to wipe out these tribes, right? Enslave these tribes and ship them out. And you have to beg to ask the question, what did they do? Okay? So we're at that point, right? They're shipped out. But now, how did they live before they were shipped out? We'll give you a better understanding of what happened when they were enslaved and moved on. When they were enslaved, well, before they were enslaved, a tribe of Chango was a tribe of Chango. If you were born in that tribe of Chango, you were a son of Chango, you were initiated in Chango, you knew the secrets of Chango. If something ever happened and you needed something from someone in a tribe of Ochung, you would travel and you would take your journey to a tribe of Ochung, and they knew all the secrets of Ochung in the tribe of Ochung, where the tribe of Chango had all the secrets of Chango, and they used to communicate that way, and they would cross, and these 7 tribes will communicate, and they will resolve amongst themselves when they were in open land and free trade, and it was all there. The problem with the 7 African powers was that at a certain point in time, that 7 African powers is enslaved. So now the powers are not there no more. Now the powers are isolated, and now they're moved from one section of the world to another section of the world, and they're slaves. All right. So now, let's say a whole ship of Chango tribe is shipped over, and they're trying to resolve a problem, right? And they resolve that problem. But now that problem is saying that, hey, you got to go see a son or a daughter of Ochun, and you got to resolve with them in order to benefit yourself and walk in Ire. Well, there's nobody of Ochun. And little by little, that problem began to cause more issues than not. So what they decided, the slaves themselves that were from Africa, was that they needed to find someone from every one of those tribes. They needed to come together to create something that was already there, which was the 7 African powers when they were free to roam, and they needed to do it again. But this time they needed to give all those powers in one shot to an initiate, so that they're able to manage and they're able to resolve difficulties and problems and situations in order to allow their guardian to be freely able to help them open up the doors and appease divinities and do whatever it is they got to do spiritually. So far, everybody's with me? I hope. So the 7 African powers has now morphed into something that we call Ocha. Okay, now Ocha is now Ocha. Ocha, we understand that in Ocha they give you they give you a bunch of handful of divinities, and those are your Ochas, and that's what you're gonna work, and there's your Orishas, right? All right. However, now remember that spider web I was telling you about, right? Here's where the spider web branches out as well. You have to be familiar with the Odum of Edibre. You got to understand what Odi Olbe is talking about when he says the 7 African powers. Odi Olbe is actually the Odum of communication, the Odum of investigation, the Odum of a lot of different things when we talk about the Eguns, when we talk about the resurrections and the lifting of the spirits. All right, so then that begs to differ the second aspect of the 7 African powers, right? And in order to understand that aspect, you have to understand spiritualism. And now that brings me to the second concept. So we understand 7 African powers so far, how they originated from here, how they moved over here, how we somewhat created Ocha out of here, but then how now that those 7 African powers, and now that the 7 African powers actually have a dual purpose, which is now the communication, how do these two communicate? What makes 7 African powers 7 African powers? We're talking about spiritualism, we're talking about Ocha. And I will tell you that they both talk about Eguns. They're both talking about Eguns. So when we talk about 7 African powers is not one divinity. When I talk about 7 African powers, I am talking about the Orishas, but I'm talking about the followers of the Orishas. I'm talking about the people who at one point in time passed away, died, and were crowned, Chango, Ochun, Yamaya, Ogun, whoever, right? And now they're in the spirit world, and they are resurrecting as part of someone's maybe cuadro, maybe they're coming out in a misa espiritual, maybe they're coming out. That's now, we're talking about the 7 African powers in an ego, in a spiritualism aspect. Misas. Now we're talking about misas, okay? So I don't want that to get confused with what Ocha was created when they talk about the 7 African powers, as far as when you see commercial products on the tables and the botanicas and everything like that. Ocha is one thing that was created based on a need that the slaves got really creative, and they followed the very old Dun or Baba Yobe when we talk about evolution, and they created something beautiful that works. That's Ocha. 7 African powers, when we talk about the 7 African tribes, and we talk about how they were slaved and they moved on, but we're talking about the 7 African tribes of people who have passed away in that ancestry. And we're talking about those that appear in misas and tambols, in different aspects of spiritualism. And when we talk about the aspect of spiritualism, we also understand, and another topic that was being discussed between my godsons and my goddaughters was, the aspect of, spiritualism itself, the misas and why we say certain prayers and why we don't say certain prayers. And And all of that, again, this is something that I had to go back and I had to do a little bit more research on to make sure I had my facts correct. But everybody forgets that even with slavery, you still had a movement of spiritualism that was going on in the early 1800s. You had movements of spiritualism even going back into the 1700s where it was mediums and there's people holding seances. And that goes into Europe, that goes into the new colonies, that goes into many, many hundreds of years ago. All right, and one of the leading spiritualists, the people who found this stuff, was in France. It was in French. Allan Kardec was a major starter of those things, and a lot of his books are stuff that started these things. The other thing that we also got to remember is that a lot of times people question what are they saying in Misa Espirituales when they talk about the Our Father and the Hail Marys and the Apostles' Creed, and they talk about different aspects, but what they're forgetting is that they're trying to invoke spirits around them. It's kind of like when you open up that first door. It doesn't matter when you open up a door, right? If you crack it open, you crack it open. Whatever's on the other side, whatever's on the other side. You open up a front door, you're opening up the front door to the world. So, being that a lot of the spiritualism evolves around, maybe some Christian prayers, that is a tradition that has worked. That's a tradition that moves. That's a tradition that's opening up the door so you can peek on the other side, so that no kidding spiritualist can pull eguns, spirits, from one side or the other. So going back to the 7 African powers, that only applies when we're talking about spirits that were crowned and spirits that are coming over and spirits that are still assisting us. And they show themselves in these misa espirituales and tambors and so forth. So when we talk about the 7 African powers, we need to understand what that needs to look like. We need to understand what is it we're talking about. We got to understand the complex nature of the 7 African powers. The communication, the resurrection of eguns, spirits, where spiritualism was birthed. So with that said, let's not confuse 7 African powers of spiritualism, which we now understand as people who are crowned and people who have passed and people who show themselves in the resurrection of communications through misa, spiritual masses and tambos and so forth, to the 7 African powers, which was the 7 tribes that were enslaved and moved on and had to resolve. And it was those tribes that came together to create something that was beautiful, which was in Cuba, which was Ocha, because that's another aspect of the 7 African powers. So when you use these terms, we have to understand that they don't necessarily interlock with each other. They correlate with each other to a certain extent. But like I said before, that spider web is crazy when you have tons of strings coming out in the middle and we use a term that's so broad like the 7 African powers. All right, with that said, I don't want to be too long-winded, but iburu iboya bucheche. I hope you like this video. 7 African powers, questions, concerns, comments, give me a like, give me a share. All right, shoot me an email. My wife and I, one of us is going to get back to you no matter what. La Regla de Ifa at gmail.com. That's la.regla.de.ifa@gmail.com. Iburu, Iboya, Ibuche, Cyberland. Thanks for tuning in.